Welcome, Professor John Hattie, to the first ever World Education Show. This follows the World Education Summit, of which you're a great feature on, and we loved having you on right at the core of it. Just a quick introduction to anyone who doesn't know John Hattie, and that'll be amazing if you don't. He turns out to be the most cited educationalist ever. Advisor to over 20 governments around the world from the University of Melbourne, and best known for his seminal work on visible learning and various other work. And the great thing about your work, John, is it's all over the world. You've been using it and looking at what's happening in school. However, some people aren't interpreting it yet, but we're going to get onto that in a moment. So welcome.
Thank you, Stephen, and it's great to be with you. And an introduction to you. You've headed up Osiris. You've been a supporter of visible learning, implemented it in so many schools over the last 15 or 20 years. So you're in this too, mate.
Well, thank you very much. And it always just brings a little tear to my eye when you hear from a member of staff from 15, 10 years ago, when they remember those moments and they say that influenced me so much in my career. So it's great that we're at this stage now and we really now get to the bottom and the heart of what educational issues are and what can be done about education moving forward. So having you to talk about these issues, brilliant. I am always taken back to the kind of passion and where the passion comes from teachers and educationalists. I'm just wondering, what about your own early experiences of education? What was it like then? What were your first experiences in school, and what kind of do you remember now about it that was kind of really influenced and really important for you?
Well, Stephen, I was brought up in a small country town and a regional town in New Zealand. And it was the 1950s. There was no television in the country. We never had a car. The sites were literally the town. I never left the town until I was about well into my teenage years. And so the world was small. And I went to the local school, and it was kind of like, wow, you can go to a place like this and be curious. And I look now at my grandchildren, aged 3 and 4, who are so curious and asking why questions. And then I worry when they then enter school and they turn to what questions and become compliant. But I never went through that phase. And in a sense, that's what's kept me going. I am still mystified and thrilled with the enigmas out there. I still want to know what's going on. I want to know the why. And that rode me through school. I'd have to say that high school wasn't like that. It was the period where compliance was dominant, and it was not my favourite time of my educational experience. But that passion to be curious, to ask why, to get the right questions on the table, I recall many instances as a kid doing that, probably seen as a little weird, but what the heck, it didn't matter. You were allowed to be. No one told me that we came from the poor side of town. No one told me you couldn't. It was just an opportunity. And indeed, if I was ever going to write a biography, it would be titled The Virtues of Naivety, not knowing. And that's kind of where I'm still at, is what's the question we're going to try and have a look at today? It's fun looking at those things.
So that hunger was there. Now, you obviously then went into teacher training. I wonder what that experience was like, because that's obviously quite formative on teachers as well.
Well, it is, but it was by sheer, not accident. The highest esteemed job in the town was in the trades. And I started an apprenticeship in painting and paper hanging. Doesn't exist anymore, Stephen, but I started my term and realised I did not like it. And what's more, there weren't many skills in it, and I didn't even have those. And so I discovered that if you trained to be a teacher, not only did they pay you to be trained to be a teacher, you could leave the town. And my mission was to get out of this town. It was kind of like a pressure. I had to get out. So I went into teaching probably for the wrong reasons. And so I went down to Dunedin, about 150 miles south of where I was brought up. And again, what an incredible opportunity that opened up. And by accident, at the time, the universities and the Teachers' College were separate. And by accident, I got a scholarship to go to the university full time. And that kind of got me on the two rungs, becoming a teacher and working in the university sector. And then I did actually teach in the real world, at a middle school and intermediate school for a year, and then in a high school for about 6 to 8 months. And then went to do the PhD, thinking that if it doesn't work, I can always come back to teaching, because it was great. Yep, here I was, working with these kids, 10 to 17-year-olds, who were also fascinated with what's going on. Like, if you, and you know this, if you got up and spoke to them and gave them all the facts and the knowledge, oh, wow, what a way to bore them. But if you got into the why do you think it's like that? Why did they do this rather than that? You can engage kids in the fun of learning. And that's what it was like for me as a teacher. And it's kind of ironic that now that I've retired 6 years ago, the thing I missed most about the academic life are the PhD students. Think of the model. They pay to come to university, they immerse themselves in a 3 to 5 year project. They do all the work, they teach me, I'm the winner, and I get paid for it. It's a great life. And watching them develop and seeing their aha moments, it's a bliss. And the thing I'm most proud of is 222 thesis students. It was the fun part. So in one sense, there is a through line. On the other sense, it's been an accident and a privilege.
So that's 220 PhD students. Plus, you were on the ARIAC board, weren't you, for a while? I think you were running that for a double circuit, which is, I think you're the only professor. The standards for the PhD students around the world.
No, I was on the International Test Commission, which is slightly different, looking at the test standards throughout the world.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that correction. So you got to see not just your 220 students, you got to see the alignment between an awful lot more students. So it gave you that massive familiarity across the world with what the data was starting to say and starts to take you in. And just before we get into that nitty gritty and that kind of evidence base and where we're going to, what have you seen as the major changes in education then since that time when you were entering into it, and now we're sort of spanning 60 years, nearly 50, yes, somewhere around there. What would you say is the significant changes that, what are the ones you'd say, yeah, that was for the better? These ones were kind of, I'm not really sure about still why we did them.
If you even go back 50 years before my time, starting school in the 1950s, schools have not changed dramatically. If a teacher from the 1900s came back to a class today, they would recognise it. If Alexander came down and looked at an iPhone, you'd say, what is that? It's such a transformation. We haven't transformed education dramatically, partly because it works. The problem is it works today for about 40% of kids, is my best estimation. Another 40% have worked out how to play the game, but if they chose, they wouldn't do it. And 20% it doesn't work for. And I think if you looked across England, any business, any industry that had a 40% success rate would be a failure. We don't see it that way because it works. And we use those 40% to defend why we keep doing things. But the thing that I think that's changed, and certainly my time from when I was a student today, is teachers are in some ways their own worst enemy because they keep taking on new tasks. They keep increasing their workload, which is a benefit for the students, but it's tough for them. And so I think the lives of teachers have become more complicated. I think it's become more relentless. And I think that's a problem we have to address and solve. And they've taken on, like, when I was a kid, they weren't responsible in one iota for my well-being. That was my parents' problem. They weren't responsible for so many things that today's schools are responsible for. So that's one big change, and they've taken it on and done a pretty good job at taking on those extras. I think the other thing is that 30 years ago, 20 years ago, there probably wouldn't be a teacher or a principal in the world that ever looked at research. It just didn't exist. That now is normal. And indeed, educators have become incredibly good critics of that research as a consequence of looking at it. And I think it's a very, very healthy direction. I think that the nature of parenting has changed over the last 50 years so that students aren't as receptive to classrooms as they used to be. So behavioural issues, engagement, motivation is a much more serious problem. Like when I was a kid, you did not misbehave. Well, you did, but the consequences were pretty dire, particularly at home. And that's a change. So there's those kind of changes. The one that drives me mad, Stephen, is curriculum. Every time there's a curriculum committee set up, they add more, and they add more, and they add more. And it's just absurd. But I do remember 1956, the best book title of any in the history of education was Teaching is a Subversive Activity. And there are some really great subversive educators out there who cut back on the curriculum so they can go deeper. And I put it to you and all your listeners there that if I said to you, what do you remember from when you were at school? I bet it was something you went deep on. So why do we keep adding more and more? And like, I look at For instance, math, one of my favourite subjects. My PhD's is in statistics, so I've nothing against it. But a recent study in the US, what percentage of adults in their job use high school maths, trigonometry, calculus, and algebra? 2%. What percent use graphing and Excel? 75%. But every math teacher says this is what you need for your future. I think we need to start looking a little bit more seriously about what we're offering these kids. We do not build children's futures. They do. And the quicker we realise that, we've got an opportunity while they're at school to teach them about how to live, how to respect others, how to respect themselves. Of course, I want precious knowledge. I think that's a key part of it. And I don't think that some countries in the world would be in the problems they were if we spent a little less time being obsessed about maths and reading and a little bit more time being obsessed about civility and citizenship. That's a change that I think is not so good. When I was a teacher,
Can I just pick up in that one? Because obviously STEM's been a massive emphasis now, probably 20, 25 years, and I'm not sure where the gain is from it.
I don't see, I think it's a missed opportunity. Like, how many schools do you know that offer engineering? And that's part of STEM. And I know a couple of schools, one in Florida, one in Santiago, that do engineering, health high school. Brilliant, unbelievably brilliant schools. Technology has not got anything necessary to do with science. There's just as much technology in the humanities as there in science. And so it's been a plea for more science and math. It's been a plea for those kind of students. And I don't see the number of students wanting to take on maths and science increasing as a consequence of it. If anything, it's gone the other way. I have nothing wrong with kids doing well in maths and science, but I want all kids to do well in maths and science. So I think STEM has been a missed opportunity, and I think it's just been another thing we've placed out there to justify more of what we've been doing. We've missed the opportunity.
So, what have we lost then from those early education experiences you were having compared with what we're doing now? I get the sense that we kind of operate in kind of fifth gear, so we're flat out the whole time, and we don't get much time in first gear to try different stuff out, to experience the kind of wider sense. But that's just from my perspective looking back on it.
Yeah, but Stephen, you've worked in schools where principals permit that to happen, and it does require leadership to permit it to happen. And it's pretty stunning. Like the schools that have taken on visible learning under your watch, it's for some schools a massive shift. And they do it. But this is where the power of leadership is so more important. And I think that's another big change. Like 50 years ago, principals were really compliance police. Bit strong. Today, some of them are, but many of them are not. Many of them are quite innovative. Many of them are prepared to take risks. Many of them are prepared to be wrong. Many of them have a focus. Like, I think every single person who goes into education goes into it for one reason, to have an impact on kids. Some principals remind teachers daily that that's their job. And I think that's incredible. Just on that, I just read a book about Indonesia, which is a stunning, what's happening in Indonesia over the last 7 or 8 years is beyond comprehension. The growth is dramatic. And it all comes down to one director general and he's just written a book called Students, Students, Students. And he said the whole role of the department in Indonesia is to support students, help teachers support students. So he's turned it on its head. Whereas, in England, the whole role of the department is to make the teachers compliant. Ofsted, make the teachers compliant. Surely, if England is not doing well, then the responsibility is the department at Ofsted, because they're responsible for helping the teachers and the leaders improve the impact on students, students, students. We've got that balance completely wrong. And so look at Indonesia. Read that book that's just come out by Hattie on this. It's a fascinating point. And the reason I liked it, it gave me hope, Stephen. If a country like that can do it today, why can't other countries turn it around?
Well, it seems we're going there on the inspection system, because obviously there's variances in inspection systems across the world. I've got lots of friends who are teachers now, day in, day out, and then for them the biggest frustration, certainly in England, has been this kind of over zealous, if you like, inspecting of what they were, the way they were teaching, if you like, and therefore the goalposts keep moving. and then suddenly what you were doing 3 years ago. So they're having to change from what they would naturally want to do with the passion, with that need to drive children. And then suddenly then that changes again. And it's always, Ofsted's fine, it's doing a really good job, because when it appraises itself, it's doing a really good job. The government don't want to admit that job might not be as good as it may be doing, or that putting people under high levels of pressure might actually drive fear. Or maybe that's what they want. I don't know. It's a difficult job. But I know in Australia it's very different.
No such thing as inspection. No such
And
thing.
and is Australia performing significantly worse as a result?
It's not, no, it's not performing worse or better, but the pressure on principals to play the game of inspectorate is not there. Now, we have other accountability measures, and many countries that have no inspection, like most of the US states don't have inspection, Canada, a lot of them don't have inspection. They find other ways around it, and I share your views. What frustrates me about Ofsted is this continuous changing. Its belief that actually it can go in and monitor the teaching. I don't want to monitor the teaching at all. I want to monitor the impact of the teaching. But if and someone asked me a while ago, and I wrote this little thing about what's the first thing I'd do as if I were the Minister of Education across England, it would be abolish Ofsted on day one, get rid of it. No one would miss it. Now, I'd probably introduce some other things to make sure, because what we find is, and we found this with Aero in New Zealand, which is kind of like Ofsted, that the schools who aren't doing very well often do better when they have an inspectorate system. But those that are doing average and doing great, they don't need it. And so Aero decided that it would change its system so that it would grant space. If you were a high-performing school, you had 5 or 7 years where you weren't going to be inspected. And they put their emphasis on the ones that did. And they turned it around under that particular leader and said, if we can't improve those schools that are not doing very well, Minister, get rid of Aero. And they improved them. So I think the whole mentality in England that all one size fits all, one system fits all, is the death knell of a creative system. Get rid of it, Stephen.
So I know one of the things you argue is you shouldn't look outside your own system necessarily. Don't take the silver bullet of a different country, because obviously education is so culturally bound. But I think one of those cultural elements is even within a country. I mean, if I look at an East... Well, because I'm sitting here in Lincolnshire at this point in time. So I'm looking at the East Coast, and it's a very different culture to a school in London, for instance, with a very high immigration population, for instance, where there may be more compliance, there may be more belief in education, whereas on some of our coastal schools, they're holiday towns of white working class, largely. And it's very difficult to kind of compare those two cultures, let alone put a prescription across the two, let alone judge them on the same scale that you were going to judge them on. Surely they need to have a wider basket of goods. I think this is something we've talked about previously.
Yeah, I want a wider basket of goods, and I want the school to decide what they prioritise in that basket of goods. I want the school to provide the evidence that they're having an impact on their students, and then I want the system, whatever that be, inspectorate or whatever, the regional directors or whatever, I want them to judge the quality of the interpretations of that. Not prescribe what's in the basket of goods and prescribe how it's being done. And look, I know I've worked in some schools where their priorities I thought were just bonkers, mad, almost criminal. And it's our job to call it. And I do call it, as you know. And if they don't have sufficient evidence, I do call it. And our whole model is based on getting the school to provide the evidence, but more importantly, getting the school to provide their interpretation, because it's them that have to deliver the interpretation. Whereas Ofsted, they give the data to Ofsted, someone in the back office does it. There's no learning. And it's just guess what the person in the back office is going to do. Education, teaching, leadership is about interpretation. It's about evaluation. It's about thinking. And that's what I want to see much more up front.
Because I think that's one of the bits that a lot of people have misinterpreted about your work, where the metadata analysis is very much about getting to an average to give you a probability. People haven't really followed the second part, which is right now use that to actually build your own evaluation system into your own school and work out, well, what's happening in my teaching, because I'm going to be very different, or what's happening across our school as teaching.
Yeah, Stephen, my work is about probabilities. Is that if you do these things, you'll have a probability you'll get a small, high, or large impact. What matters is your implementation of that. And if you implement a high probability, you won't have an impact. And so that implementation, and I'm quite blunt right up front, and this is why I work with people like you and others around the world. I'm not the implementer, you guys are. And you've done a stunning job of getting the schools to interpret that data. My constant question, like my career was as a statistician in the measurement in business. It was nothing to do with visible learning. And my whole career in measurement was about, now how do you interpret that? What does it mean? Why have you done this rather than that? Like if you ask me how to do a structural equation model or an item response theory, I can do that in my sleep. That's my bread and butter. But what does it mean? And I think that's the exciting thing about the whole visible learning. And you're right, I've provided you the data. So what? What does it mean? How do you interpret it? And like, I can give you the averages, I can give you the variability, I can give you what moderators are, whether it differs in the east of England, whether it differs in London. But the core question remains, why? Why is it so? Yeah, and that's what keeps me going.
And then from that, what we're going to do about it. I'm just wondering, we mentioned obviously inspection, we're saying is probably not as a blocker now on the current system, certainly in England. I'm wondering what other blockers you see out there on the system, on the whole of the education system developing. You know, what other things do you think, you know, that's putting the brakes on it really rather than actually helping? You mentioned curriculum as well. And
Curriculum's another one. Here's another one, Stephen. Like the visible learning story is this simple. Do you have the courage to reliably identify those teachers and students who are getting their students gain more than at least a year's growth for a year's input, form a coalition of success around them, invite others to join? And so that brings me to one of the biggest problems in education, the lack of courage. It really takes a courageous leader to do this work. It's so much easier, and I say this with all respect, it's so much easier to stop by just appeasing the adults in the building. And of course, I want to be nice to the adults. Nothing wrong with that. But it's the impact those adults are having. And if you're finding cases where kids aren't getting an impact, you got to work with those teachers. It's as simple as that. Whereas sometimes we allow discussions to blame the curriculum, the class size, the resources, the nature of the kids, the quality of the parents and all that. A great leader says no. It's what we do. We cause, and you've seen the data, we are incredibly good at making an impact on kids. It kind of keeps me going as the excellence that's all around us. But not everyone, not all the time. And that's the courage we need to do to help to do that, and to do it in a really high trust environment where there's no blame. Because you know, Stephen, if I blame you for something and tell you you're doing a lousy job, and then the next thing I say to you, Stephen, I want to work with you to improve, I know what you're going to tell me. Go away. So how do I build that relationship so that we can work together? And I think that's another problem I see, is that we still are in a business where we have independent contractors. And if you look at the visible learning work, one of the strongest effects is teachers working with each other. Teachers are brilliant critics, and we don't optimize that. And I mean that in a really positive way. And we don't optimize that. And again, great leadership makes that happen. How do you get teachers together to moderate their assessments, their feedback? How do you get teachers together to help each other see what's happening in their classrooms? Like remembering Graham Nuttall's work, 80% of what happens in a classroom a teacher doesn't see or hear. How do you get other teachers to help you see that other 80%? This is where that collective, so it's the collective, it's the curriculum, it's the courage, it's that sense of working together. And the other thing we don't do as a profession is our career structure. Like, this is madness, Stephen. You know, here in Australia, after about 7 or 8 years, the pay structure was flat. There is no incentive, and I don't just mean money, there are no incentive to be excellent. In fact, if a 20-year-old teacher spent $100,000 of their own going to professional learning to improve what they're doing, no one other than their family would know or even care about it. How come we've got a structure that doesn't reward that excellence? It's no wonder so many teachers are moving out to pay the mortgage into leadership. So many of them are going into consulting, getting out of the classroom. We need a structure that keeps our best teachers in the classroom, and we don't have one. No, I want to be upfront. I'm not talking about performance pay. I'm not talking about performance pay. There are many other systems, and we have one here in Australia that is starting to work. Early days, some tough things to get through. Some teachers do not want to be recognised, and they don't necessarily want to work with other teachers to improve what's going on. And so there are some barriers there. But this is where leadership can make the difference. Leadership not only in the school, But like I go back to the Indonesian example, one person changed a country with 17,000 islands, 200 or 300 million people by himself.
But it shows what's possible to do there. What would you say, in terms of optimism? You can't help but turning a pessimism into an optimism, which is part of the reason I love your work. But the second one is, what do you see out there as really enablers that have grown up in the last, in that over this period, which you say, right, these are tools that teachers should be using, or systems should be using, or the government could be using. I mean, you've talked a bit about the professionalism or the engagement, and certainly with the research from there, that teachers have got that knowledge. One thing I hear, for instance, is that, teachers got the knowledge, but they don't always change what they're doing. And I think that might be overly critical of teachers, because they might be but what other enablers have you seen coming up which we could be using a bit better than?
And so what I look at, Stephen, is exactly what you said there. What about those teachers who actually, after 10 or 15 years, do change what they do? They do improve what they do. And that's probably the most exciting thing. And I think part of that comes from that last 15 or 20 years of research infiltrating into schools. That way of thinking, why is it so, is starting to influence many, many teachers. And they're not necessarily happy with what they're doing. And there's that old saying that if you're happy with the outcomes you're getting, keep doing what you're doing. If you're not happy, you have to change. Well, some teachers are not happy, and they're saying, how can I do it different to get better and have more impact? And I see that so often as I travel throughout the world and the work we use. And I've got data from 100,000 plus teachers who've gone through the visible learning journey, and the constant message is, hey, we now see our teaching differently. We see it through the eyes of kids to complement how we see it through our eyes. That's a massive change for some teachers, and it's got nothing to do with how many years experience. It's to do with that ways of thinking. And it's that phrase that I think is so strong, is that it's less what teachers do that matters and more how they think about what they do. That when that happens, you see it, you feel it. And teachers often need support from others when they do that, because thinking aloud, thinking by yourself can be a very lonely activity. How do you think with others? And I think that's the thing that you see as transformational. So yes, there is a barrier, and that is those teachers who are in the rut. They've been doing it, they know exactly how to do it, there's nothing wrong necessarily with what they do. But the kids have to conform, and that's not the job. We have to better understand our kids. We have to involve more. Like the crisis here in Australia and New Zealand, or was New Zealand, less so now, but it's still in Australia, is 20% of kids who start high school don't finish high school. The cost to society of those kids at age 30 is huge. And that's very sad.
Because say similarly in England, we're now looking at 1 million NEETs. And then it's interesting here, because now suddenly we get the chain reaction of this, of celebrities. Gareth Southgate, the ex-England manager, has now come out and said, oh, we're doing girls and boys wrongly, we should be teaching them differently. And you're thinking, well, hang on, this is the England ex-football manager. I'm going to come on to some of these issues a little in a moment. But this NEETs thing does suggest that the system somewhere we've gone a little bit wrong. You did mention in terms of the whole welfare thing that teachers have had to take on board. It used to be called pastoral care when we started out, and that was really, it was about building a tutor group together so people will help and keep a lookout for it. Now it seems to be more and more of an emphasis on teachers to do that, and eating up a lot more time, and almost a limitless amount of time it's got the potential to eat up within it. I'm just wondering how you're seeing that one playing out at the moment.
Yeah, like schools have been taking on these extra roles, and certainly post-COVID even more so. And yes, we should be concerned about the wellness, the happiness, the flourishing, or whatever the latest jargon words are for all these kids. But I remind you also that some of our best education moments come at a moment of boredom, when we make a connection that from sort of thinking about other things. Oh, my goodness. Some of our best thoughts come from pressure. I'm a great fan of the aha moment, which often follows massive pressure to study something, to understand it. And so there is that dilemma and frustration. If you're very frustrated when solving a problem and you solve it, that's much more long-term gains than when you are frustrated and you don't solve a problem, or you're not frustrated and you solve a problem. So we've got to be careful when we talk about these things, that we don't see them all as positive as negatives. There's a right time and there's a wrong time. But going to your notion of welfare, like I think it's a society has demanded schools take that on. I worry about the medicalisation that's happening in our schools. They're very expensive to deal with it. Medicos like working one on one, class size of one on one. They love that, and it's just not sustainable in our current system. And so I know in our country now we're looking at other ways to solve the problem of working with those kids and providing those resources, but it's costing an incredible amount of the education budget to do this. The other thing I'd like to comment on that is we talk about wellness of kids. We even talk about wellness of teachers. It's interesting, the meta-analysis, the effect size of wellness of teachers on kids' achievement is about 0.1, which is pretty small, which I think reflects the incredible professionalism of teachers. They don't bring their wellness problems to the classroom. They leave it in the door and they take them home. We still have to worry about it. I think, therefore, we have to worry about them even more. But no one's talking about how do you help teachers teach wellness to kids. And I think that's something we need to get better at. And how do we do that in the typical classroom, in a typical day? It's not easy to deal with those things. But I think throwing more and more adults into the school is not necessarily the right answer. It's how do we get teachers to do that? And that's another big demand and request on teachers. And wow, as you know, I want to take things off the board. I want to de-implement. That's even tougher.
So that's going to be the challenge of what can we de-implement and what do we de-implement. I think that's really interesting where you said on the one hand more boredom and on the other hand more pressure as well, because they're the test scenarios where the brain really does have to use its wave intelligence that's very different from this kind of logical structure of curriculum that we've developed.
One of the things that intrigued me, Stephen, and this is the why question, it was why post-COVID have we got all this discussion about teacher retention, shortage of teachers, workload, burnout, principal saying, etc. And when I looked at all the data I could find here in Australia, I couldn't find any difference pre or post-COVID to any of those issues. But the discussion's huge. And so my query is why? And my hypothesis, and I don't have a lot of data for this, but my hypothesis is that it's not workload and burnout that's the problem, it's the relentlessness. I think this is the problem we have to solve, is how do we stop it being relentless? Like I asked listeners who are teachers, what was it like teaching during COVID? You could have a coffee, you could put the washing on, you could take the dog for a walk. It wasn't as relentless. When you stopped and turned your screen off, you didn't have kids coming to you. You didn't walk around the classroom. And we're our own worst enemies sometimes in that we are on the job all the time when we're in our school. And so one government here in Australia decided relentlessness was a problem and legislated that teachers couldn't be in a classroom more than 4 days a week. It's solved many of the problems that we have out there. So I think I want to change the question here. And like, as you know, I've looked at de-implementation and struggled to get that going. Because if you take 10 hours off a teacher or a principal, they replace it the next day with another 10 hours and say, no, that's not the problem to solve. The problem is relentlessness. How do we give them breathing spaces? How do we give them time during the day to work with others? And as you know, in our visible learning program, we like to structure the professional learning during the day, not after school, not weekends, because it's part of the job. Yes, it costs, but it's the best investment we make.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the difficulties, isn't it? As humans, particularly as teachers, there's a lot of caring goes on, but in some ways that adds to the relentlessness, and it's a kind of over caring. And some of these issues will be dilemmas or problems that people can solve, but once you get caught up in the whirl of it, it's quite difficult then to differentiate between those two, and you end up trying to solve dilemmas, or you're trying to solve problems that people could solve by themselves, given a little bit more time.
It's kind of fascinating that teachers being fundamentally kind people is a massive asset and a problem.
Yeah, well, there you go. we'll look on that. Right, I'm gonna hit you with some issues for quick fire answers, just to get your thoughts, because these are kind of very current at the moment. We'll start with labelling. Where are you on labelling? Because obviously we've got this ADHD, we've got the autism really increasing quite dramatically at this point, and then you've got Gabor Mate saying, look, ADHD is just a human trait and it's a spectrum and not really the thing. So I'm just wondering where your take is on that within the learning context, on the whole use of labels within education.
Well, in terms of the meta-analyses, it's the largest negative effect of the lot, minus 0.6. And the question is why? If you take two kids of the same behaviour, the same personality, and you label one, and you've said it, ADHD on the spectrum, Asperger's, whatever you want to call it, you get a minus zero point 0.6 effect compared to the same kid who's not labelled. And it comes back very much to expectations. We have expectations for those kids and we feed those expectations. With kids not labelled, we don't feed the expectations. We make that kid struggle. We make that kid learn. We find ways to find out where they're at so that we can do the +1 increase and improve what they're doing. Kids know when they're labelled, they don't get the same work. They don't get the same opportunity as other kids. Now, notice what I didn't say. I didn't say ADHD or Asperger's or spectrum didn't exist. Those kids exist. Your colleague, Joe Elliott's written a book wondering whether some of those things actually exist or whether they, whatever they are. That's a really interesting debate. But I just worry that the increasing labelling has led to, it's led to, for example, my child needs to be accommodated. I want to have personalisation. I want individualisation. And they have amongst the lowest effects of the lot because kids work with each other. They work cooperatively. They work with the teacher. It's a bit like putting a kid on a computer and saying, spend the next 4 hours being coached on the computer. That's nowhere near as effective of 1 hour interacting with other kids. And we need to teach kids to work alone and work with others. And so often when we get these labels, oh no, they can't do that. Well, they can't? That's never in my vocabulary. For me, my vocabulary says every can't is an opportunity to teach. And there are some stunning teachers out there with those kids with those labels doing stunning jobs. Now, I've got nothing wrong with some of those issues. I think when APA went and got rid of the Asperger's and the degrees of autism and put them all on a spectrum, created a nightmare because those kids differ dramatically from each other. And you take a group of class of kids that have all been labelled autistic, they are dramatically different. So you can see why the label sometimes can be the biggest barrier. So nothing wrong with good diagnosis, but every time you hear a label as an educator, you should say, I can deal with that. I can educate. I can make a difference. I can improve. Don't let the label get in the way.
So setting.
That's an English word. What's setting mean?
Setting means structuring the groups by ability and giving them different work. Like mathematics seems to be the most commonly set subject here. I read a statistic that in one way or another, 96% of British schools set. When I've asked people anecdotally, they think that they don't, but I know you've got a different view on this.
Setting, tracking, streaming, all the different names for it. And I spent a lot of time in the SQL visible learning looking at that, and my bottom line is I can't see any winners in terms of the students. I can see winners in terms of teachers. There's a hierarchy. It is the case that the more experienced, more senior teachers get the higher streams compared to those who are not. And so there is differential teaching in that. But I struggle to see that. And when I go to countries that have no streaming, no setting, and some countries have banned it, I see just as good quality education. I know it's easier for teachers. We also know a truism that you take any year group, year 6, you've got a 4 to 5 year variance within that group. I think it's madness that most countries have a curriculum based on year groups, which forces these debates. I see another thing that worries me, Stephen, is when countries decide that kids start school at a particular time of the year when they turn 5. In countries where they start school on the term or the semester they turn 5 or on the day they turn 5, they don't have all the redshirting problems of the early days and worrying about whether kids should start early, late, and all that kind of setting issue. So I think we've created a rod for our own back here. I'm not pretending that dealing with the variance is easy, but I am saying that it is an advantage of all kids that happens. And so I think we need to get over it and say that streaming is a segregation policy, usually driven by the same issues that deal with most kinds of desegregation issues. Parents say, I don't want my child going to school with those kids. That is an indefensible claim. Those kids are going to grow up and they're going to work with all kinds of kids right across the spectrum. Why aren't we creating our schools as the same kind of democracy where we teach them how to work with other kids of differential abilities, differential skills, and help the teachers find ways to deal with that? So no, I'm not a fan of the setting at all.
Great. Boys and girls we mentioned earlier. Is there a difference statistically in any of your research if you come? Do we need to teach them differently?
One of the largest blocks of research in the whole business. The effect size is really, really tiny, still slightly in favour of boys, but it depends on the subject. Is there any writing involved that favours girls? No, and then the bottom line is you take a group of boys, you take a group of girls. There's just as much variance in those two groups. So putting them together, it makes no difference. Do we socialise them different? Yes, we do. That still happens, and there's been a massive credit to the women's movement over the last 50 years compared to when I was a kid. That's not as defensible as it used to be, and it should be abolished, those kind of differential expectations that we had. And so I think that's really made a difference. Yes, I think we do socialise our boys and girls somewhat differently, and being a parent, I know how tough that is to not do that, because they pick up from their peers, socialisation things. So that's still an issue, but there's no reason why any child can't. There's no reason why any child can't succeed and be excellent in whatever they want to do. And it's going back to what we were saying earlier. I take the view, particularly in high school, that we should be certifying kids on the basis of what they can do and how well they can do it. I'm less worried about the what is. I think being excellent at coaching or plumbing or chemistry and history is the same thing. Excellence. And I want an excellent plumber and I want an excellent physician. But our schools differentiate between those and come up with all kinds of streaming to say that it's not good enough. And I'm drifting off your subject of boys and girls, but boys and girls, for goodness sake, if you're going to be an educator, let's get a problem on the table that's worth fixing. That ain't one.
They're all learners in the end, and learners the thing that's kind of human across the globe, which is really interesting as well, whereas the curriculum and sometimes the teaching is quite culturally bound. EDI, this seems to be coming up more and more. So equity, diversity and inclusion. Just wondering where you are on that, because it seems to be getting a lot of criticism in the wider society, yet in schools it's something we have to face on a day-in-day basis because we're responsible in the end for integrating a culture.
Look, Stephen, many countries are very good at being linguistic policemen. And like you know, in America, those words are banned, not allowed to be used. It doesn't take away the problem. It doesn't take away the concepts. And so the way and a lot of my work is coming up with a better narrative to deal with the issue. And the narrative that I use is, what's the culture and climate of the classroom? Is this a classroom where the students feel they belong? Is this a classroom where the students feel they're invited to come to learn? And I take a very strong line that a fundamental responsibility of the school leaders is the culture and climate in every class and across the school. And I want to judge that, school leaders, by asking the students, do they feel they belong? Yeah, the Jenkins curve. Do you want to come to school to learn the stuff the teachers are teaching you? We know 95% of 5-year-olds say yes. By the end of primary, start of high school, 4 out of 10 say yes. Not good enough. And so if you phrase it in terms of belonging and invitational, then you have to deal with the DEI stuff. But if you put DEI at the front, so often we get into negative discussions about why it's not working for these kids. I want to know why it's working for these kids. Like here in Australia, I've been in classes, I've been in schools where Aboriginal kids, migrant kids are there, and they're stunning. And then we turn around and say, we have a problem with migrant education, we have a problem with Aboriginal education. What racist terms they are. Migrants in Australia outperform locals. Many, not all, but many Aboriginal kids do incredibly well, and many teachers do incredibly well. So how do we look at the excellence and scale it up? We may want to say we're not scaling it up as much as we should, and that's a DEI issue. So DEI, yeah, I'm not a great fan of having that as the dialogue, not because it's not important, but because it gets hijacked, it gets seen as a problem, and nothing changes. What I want to change is, does every child who walks in the school gate, regardless of their background, regardless of their colour, regardless of their postcode, feel invited and belong and are making at least a year's growth for a year's input?
That's nice. Moving it on to the conversation around belonging. Here's one that I know you've been doing a lot of work on recently: technology and the slow revolution, and AI.
Yeah, technology is there's been over 400 meta-analyses on technology, computers, over the last 50, 60 years, and only recently is it starting to touch on average 0.4. It has not been a major success. Not because teachers don't use technology, they're very big users of technology for themselves, but it has not changed, hardly at all, how teachers teach. It's led to more efficiencies, but not more effectiveness. And so I look at AI, which has been, I think, is the biggest change in my lifetime, and it's not going to have a slow trajectory. It's going to have a very fast trajectory. And I worry that even now, 3 years later, most of the discussion is about guardrails and ethics and banning it and kids misusing it and cheating and essays and assignments, etc. And in the meantime, it's accelerating and kids are getting smarter and smarter. And so I'm looking for ways about how we can get the discussion of AI in our schools as fast as we can. And my logic at the moment, and I'm working with some systems around the world on this, is to get what I think is the right question on the table, which is what are the skills that we need to teach students to effectively use AI? Now, if you do that, Stephen, you automatically answer the question, what skills do teachers need? Because they have to have those skills. And I'll give you a couple. We have to teach our students to ask probative questions. And when I look at the research on questioning, I know teachers ask between about 150 questions a day that require less than 3-word answers. I know that 90% of them are about the facts. Every kid knows that every question the teacher asks, they know the answer to. How many questions does a class ask about their work they don't understand? 2 per day. We don't teach kids to ask questions. On AI, if you ask AI the wrong question, it will give you a stunningly impressive answer. It's the wrong question. And then how do you probe? And it's fascinating when you look at the employment in the AI sector, the biggest employment is for probative engineers. So why aren't we learning from that about how we teach kids to ask questions and probe? Let me give you a second one. Who's in charge of quality in the classroom? The teacher decides what's being taught, how it's being taught, what the activities are, what the resources are, what the test is, what the feedback is when they stop doing it. In AI, that is hopeless. We have to teach our kids, is it right, is it wrong, and how do you know? We have to teach our kids, is it good enough, and how do you know? We have to teach them to seek help. We have to teach them to ask the right question. And these are incredibly critical skills. I would argue not just for AI, but for society. But we don't do any of that at the moment. And so I'm looking to say, can we have a debate on what some of these key skills are? Let's not get too many, but let's start teaching some of these skills so that when kids are using AI, they're better equipped to deal with this technology. That way we may get in front of the problem rather than behind it.
Yeah, and I think someone was saying, which is quite correct, AI is brilliant at answering questions, which I think you're inferring there. But asking questions, it's that's where the humans come in. Then AI just isn't very good at asking the questions it wants to ask, or that would probe deeply into it, if you like. Autonomy, and I'm talking about here school autonomy, teacher autonomy, and student autonomy.
Look, it's not my favourite word at all. I don't think my plumber has autonomy to fix my pipes the way he wants. I don't think my airline pilot has autonomy to fly the plane they like. Heaven help me if my doctor has autonomy to use the kind of leeches and other things that they'd like to use. And I don't think teachers have autonomy. All those professions have duties and responsibilities. And within those duties and responsibilities, they exact professional judgment, adaptive expertise, evaluative thinking. And in that sense, there's autonomy to exercise those skills. But too often, autonomy in education means leave me alone, I'm going to do it my way. I've been doing it for 10 years, I'm going to keep doing it. I have no time for that concept of autonomy. I think it's all about the impact you're having on students, and your duty and responsibility is to have that impact, have discussions about what you mean by impact, have discussions to what you mean by whether you're being successful at it. And that's the kind of duties and responsibilities. And I'd love some good philosophy people to look at this problem of autonomy. It's so misunderstood and misused in education, such that I ban the term. I don't have autonomy to do what I want. I have duties and responsibilities, and I want to be more explicit about those.
Okay, here we go then next. Teach first. Let's try teach first, or teach for America, or other ones where they've advanced graduate thing. How do you think that's effective? It was an experiment to try and solve a very specific issue, which was recruitment to teaching. Obviously, it suffered from a high degree of turnover of teachers. But I'm just wondering what you're looking at it now and seeing is this been a success? Is this something that really needs to rethink itself?
Like, we have a system in your country and mine, the US, where one institution wants dominance over how you train teachers, universities. And ironically, every one of those universities run different programs. There is no common core. And then they disagree when someone goes out of the institutional system and sets something up different. My argument is if they have evidence and they seek evidence of the impact of their students, teachers, on students, I'm supporting them. And I have supported the Teach for Australia movement because they have looked at that evidence. I've seen it. I've been involved with seeing and interpreting it and them showing me this. I go to many universities and they can show me no evidence other than glossy magazines and odd case studies of the most brilliant student they've ever had, which every institution has, of course. And so I look at those and say, viva la difference, provided they can put the evidence that they're making a difference. And when I look at Teach First, and certainly in their early days, they were making a difference because they were specifically focused on hard to teach areas, they were specifically focused on hard to teach subjects, and they were specifically focused on how you make those very early teachers school leaders and grow them so they don't just stay and see their job as forever being in a classroom. And you mentioned turnover. It's not as bad as many think. Certainly here in Australia, it's not. And if there is a turnover and we get 1, 2, 3 years out of them, I'll take it. My experience working with them, they're above the norm in terms, on average, smart people. And to take on, with that kind of smarts, to take on that mission in some of our hardest to teach schools, wow, I take my hat off to them. So no, I'm a fan of any program that can provide me evidence, and this is what we've done here in Australia, is that every institution now has to put evidence on the table, moderated by a consortium of universities, as to the impact it's having on its students and their students when they teach. And that's changed the dialogue, it's changed the nature of many courses dramatically. And I think that's a very healthy thing, and Teach for Australia has done well under that.
Fabulous. And then we're going to teaching aids or teaching assistants, which I think there's been about, 23 years worth of them. They didn't exist before then, brought in as, again, an experiment. I think it was Tony Blair actually might have been responsible for that particular one. In England anyway, certainly, but in...
And Peter Blatchford, who's done the most work in the world on this out of England, is about to produce a stunning book, because I was a reviewer of it before it came out, that looks at all the incredible work he's done on it. And at one point he said their effect is toxic, but strong, stronger than I'd say, but we know the overall effect is pretty low to zero. But we also know in England and in Australia that there is almost as many non-teaching adults in our schools now as there are adults, as there are teachers, for no great gain. I know it adds often an extra load for the teacher. It doesn't take away from the teacher, but I also know why people like them. They do the work for the kid. They're seen as one-on-one. Parents love them. The kids love them. And Peter, in the early days when I talked to him about the work, he changed the question. This is why I have so much time and credit for him. He said, look, we know they have a very low effect, so our job is to find a way for them to have a positive effect. They're not going away. But I don't see a lot of that happening. I just see them being dumped into schools, put with the kids who most need the specialists get the amateurs. I know in parts of Australia where I've suggested that the teaching aides work with the other kids while the teacher deals with the kids with the greatest needs, and it's illegal under the union contract rules. I think that's madness. So I don't think they have been the answer. I think they've added to the problems we have in schools. They're cheap relative to teachers. So in that sense, but even though the numbers increased so much. So they do serve purposes of keeping those kids out of the hands of the other kids and out of the hands of the teachers. But I don't see a lot of evidence they make the difference. And I want the research world to turn it on its head and say, how do we take all these non-teaching adults in our schools and turn them into positive attributes on the impact of our students and on reducing the relentlessness on our teachers?
Nice one. So, John, well, I'm just going to mention now, because feedback is your actually most cited piece of work, the work with Helen Timperley. And I know you've been revisiting that, and we're really excited because you're going to be doing a course with us on the new findings and how it's moving forward. Just wondering if you could just give people a little preview of that work and, what we're going to be focusing on there.
Yeah, it is. If you look at all the influences that are above average in visible learning, feedback is a pretty strong ingredient in needing them all. The problem is a third of feedback has a 0 to negative effect. The variability is the issue, and solving that variability is the problem. And I know a few years ago with Shirley Clark, we produced a book on feedback specifically trying to look at that variability. And so I think we know an incredible amount about effective feedback. Effective feedback, in a nutshell, is that which is heard, understood, and actionable by the student, by the recipient. We also know that feedback costs. It means I have to do more work, have to do it again, wasn't good enough. And so there are costs. Sometimes the costs come because I don't trust the teacher, or the cost comes because the feedback I get doesn't help me understand or action. Like kids get an incredible amount of feedback that they don't know how to use and can't use. Like all academics, when they're given a job, are given a pen that only ticks in red. That's useless in terms of improving what the work is. So I think we know an incredible amount about feedback, and one of the things that's just sort of happened with AI is the number of feedback engines that have come out is dramatic. Like I probably get one or two people a week approach me with their new feedback engine, and will I look at it and approve it and endorse it? And I never endorse projects at all, so that's easy. And most of them are pretty good. But what I started to realize was that we've been, for example, computer marking of essays and feedback on essays. We've been doing that in the measurement community for 40, 50 years. And what AI has done is they've sped up the release of that to schools. And that's kind of good. But they're doing what we've been doing for the last 40 years better. And they're missing an opportunity to do it different. And that's what my latest work is about. There's a team of us looking at this whole thing. Like take, for example, Stephen, teacher gives feedback. Great. Kid seeks feedback. Excellent. Kid interprets feedback. Great. But where's the conversation? Where's the feedback dialogue? Where's the time where I can say to you, Stephen, my teacher, I don't understand what you said. Can you explain it again? And I was at school in Nome, Alaska last year, and this happened where the teacher at the end of presenting this maths thing said to the class, do you understand? And this girl said, no. I thought, oh, she's in trouble. And the teacher then re-explained it. I looked at her and said, do you understand it now? And she said, no. 4 times he did it, and she said, oh, I think I'm getting it. And I was so impressed that the climate was such that she could say no because she didn't understand. She might have said it a little more aggressively than perhaps I would have liked as a human being, but she said no. Now, you can ask AI 30 times and it won't get upset. You can ask it to explain it differently, because what often a teacher will do is they'll explain it again the same way, and it didn't get it the first time. And so how do you create that time? And like I'm writing something now, Stephen, and I want some feedback right this minute. Is this correct, what I've just written? AI can tell me, no, you should check this out, or you should go there. Now, one of the things I want to be careful here, we should never talk about AI. We should talk about AI prompts. If the prompts are right, if you get the wrong prompts, it won't work. So I think there's an opportunity in feedback to create more feedback dialogue between the student, the teacher, the AI, and their peers at the same time. And I think that's really, really exciting. And we need to have conversations, feedback conversations, about the quality of the feedback the AI gives, about the quality of the feedback the teacher gives, about the quality of the feedback that I seek myself. And I think that's the opportunity that AI provides that no one's picking up yet.
So that's great. So what we're going to be doing with the feedback one is we're going to be getting under the bonnet there, really pulling it apart with John. Every teacher's giving feedback. Everyone knows the theory, but the practice just isn't working across the board there. Sometimes it's excellent, sometimes it isn't. So it's probably the chance for schools to get rid of that variability, and as a result, in a positive way, I should say, get rid of that variability. Second one then you're going to go on to do with us is getting students to drive their own learning. I'm very excited about that. I've seen the previews of this experience, this new course. I know you're using AI as well as part of the course in how to develop the teaching. I wonder if you could just kind of give us the potted version of it as well there, just to get people excited about what's possible here.
A few years ago, a meta-analysis came out on student control over learning, and the effect size was 0. And it makes perfectly sense. We're not in control of our learning, Stephen. We need expertise. Vygotsky's soda proximal development. We need an expert who can take us to the next area. Novices don't know what they don't know. And this is where control over your learning. So I've spent a lot of time saying, what's the right metaphor? Because the concept's kind of right. We want kids to have some control over their learning. So the narrative that we use is we want students to be taught to drive their learning. In the same way when you taught your kids how to drive a car, you started off with a lot of control, teacher. the main driver, but you had to release responsibility. Not gradually, but responsibly. And one day, you had to get out of the car and let the kid drive. Now, that kind of metaphor, that narrative is how we see classrooms. Now, I used to say the visible learning story was teachers seeing learning through the eyes of students and students becoming their own teachers. I've changed it. I want teachers to see learning through the eyes of their students, but I want teachers to teach students how to drive their learning so that they know what to do when they don't know what to do. They know when to seek help, to seek expertise. They know how to work with others, how to work by themselves. They know how to choose the right learning strategies that are optimal for that moment, often being taught by a teacher how to choose those strategies. And so this whole notion of how we get kids to do it. Now, when teachers say to me, it's too hard, I say, go into a class of 4 or 5-year-olds. They do it every minute. Why is it that we take that driving responsibility off them and we put them in the bus and we take them all along the same route to the same destination when they're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and onwards? We need the courage to let them drive the bus themselves. Are they going to go down cul-de-sacs? Are they going to have crashes? Are they going to go over the speed limit? Are they going to sit on the side of the road? Absolutely yes. That's our job, to help them in those circumstances. Our job is not to always be in the driver's seat. And that metaphor comes in. So I want kids to know I want to be able to ask them, how do you know you're successful in today's lesson? Give me an example, a worked example of what you're aiming for. Is it better than what you're doing? So what do you have to do to get from where you are to get to where you need to be? What kind of strategies are you using? And are they the optimal strategies and why did you choose them? These are the kind of discussions I want kids to have because that's what you have in your everyday life when you do your work. That's what we want kids to do. That's what 4 and 5-year-olds do. That's what they do when they play. That's what they do when they play their computer games. Why can't we do that in the classroom?
There you go. I mean, my early work was in independent learning, which I think is probably a misnomer term now. The more I know about it, the less I'm kind of happy with it as a term. But the concept probably sits there. I remember Carl Rogers' work in the 70s was saying that probably 30% of kids are capable of an independent learning approach, whereas 70% were. And I think when we re-looked at it, probably in the 80s, it was down to 20%, just because we'd, in some ways, developed more of a dependency within the teaching methods we're using. So you're kind of trying to reverse this one out with it. So it sounds like we're bang on where we're going.
There's a massive conspiracy here, and it's in the opposite direction to what you might think. Kids above average prefer the dependency. They prefer facts, because that's the game they're winners at, not in their own best interests.
There we go. We've had it there. Right. So I'm going to end, John, on what should we be focusing at? I mean, there's various levels here. The first level I'm going to go is a system level. If you were a government, or if you advise governments over the world, what's the one thing that because you can only get them to focus on one thing, I think, really now. What's the one thing you would say to the government or the system leaders to focus on?
Invest in teacher educator expertise.
And that's new teachers and existing teachers, yeah?
Totally. Yep. Like, can you imagine your doctor saying, I'm very proud of the fact I've never been to professional learning since I left my university? It's an expensive endeavour to provide that professional learning. And of course, professional learning varies in its quality of impact, but it's the right debate. How do we constantly help our teachers see their impact, understand what they mean by impact, and do that together? Expensive, but pays off.
Nice one. Second one, the whole school. If I'm a whole school, what should I be focusing on as a whole school activity?
The first thing, as a school leader, I want the evidence that every student in this school feels invited and belongs and wants to come to the school to learn. If you don't get the culture and climate right, the rest doesn't happen. And then I worry about whether those school leaders have employed 20, 30 independent contractors or whether they have a team working and are using that critique, that collective advocacy to share. It is, hey, Stephen, we've got some tough kids out there. We've got some kids that are not very pleasant at times, but those are the kids that most we need in our schools, and those are the ones that we need to find the best teachers of for those kids, and many schools do a stunning job on that. So how do we share that knowledge and understanding? How do we become a profession in the sense that we have a community of practice alongside all that visible learning stuff, but also in terms of what's happening in our schools?
Nice one. And then on to leaders. If I'm a school leader, what's my one thing that I should be getting up every day, looking in the mirror and going?
Every time you walk into a class, staff room, every time you walk into a school, every day I want you to ask the one question. How do I know the quality of my impact today? And if you ask that question, all good things follow. What is your impact? What does it mean? How do you know you're having it? And that's it.
So that runs across leaders and teachers, then I'm guessing.
Yes.
Teaching assistants and the teacher aides, as we said, the impact's difficult to measure in terms of to find something really positive about. What's the one thing they could be doing that would make a bigger difference?
Well, I come to the notion for all educators, but particularly for teacher aides, this notion of evaluative thinking, this notion of asking yourself, is this the best decision for this child now for him or her to learn? As opposed to, is this the best thing for them to do to complete the work? Learning is not about completing the work on time to the right length and the right prettiness. It's about the struggle. It's about the hard work. It's about all those kind of things. And it's that notion of, when do I sit back out of the driver's seat and when do I give help? It's a tough one to do, but without that, those teacher aides will become the person that the student depends on and does the work for them in lots of different ways, and that's not in their interest. So sit back a bit more and watch the kids struggle. Struggle's a good thing, to a point.
Yeah. Great. And I know you've done a lot of work on parenting and now grandparenting. So I'm just wondering, in terms of parents, if we've got any parents, a lot of teachers obviously are already parents and grandparents as well. So I wonder what would be your one thing that you would get them to do or make them look at?
Oh, the most obvious one is love their kids. That's pretty critical and essential. Wish it happened everywhere, but that's the first one. As you know, Stephen, I wrote a book with my son on this a few years ago, and we took the very strong argument that parents are not first teachers. That's a myth. That's led all kinds of weird, absurd, crazy things. Our argument is parents are first learners. How they learn is often how their kids learn. So parents, look at what you do when you struggle. Look at what you do when you get something wrong. Are they learning opportunities or are they embarrassments? Do you get happy when you struggle or do you get angry? Because I guarantee you, that's what your kids will do too.
Well, you're the role model, aren't you? And they see you. That's what they're copying. You're the inherited genes as well. So, yeah, unconditional love right at the heart of it. Then that's really great. And then I know the one that's most passionate in you is the learners themselves. I'm a learner. Obviously, I've got a daughter who's a learner, still at school. I've got older kids who are out there learning it day in, day out. What's the one thing that the learners should be thinking to themselves each day or reminding themselves of?
Look, I'm a great fan of the aha moment. I want more aha moments in the everyday life of kids. Even one a day is a massive increase on the number they have at the moment. That notion when you finally make a connection between ideas, when finally the struggle is worth it, and that's where the happiness and joy comes, and that's motivation. Like we know that if we choose interesting, authentic, real-world problems, kids are more likely to want to do them. But the opposite also happens. When you make learning gains, you are motivated to keep learning. And those aha moments are probably the most powerful motivation tools we have in our business, and we don't use them enough. So come on, teachers, generate more aha moments. Because aha moments is an exciting feel. Feeling. It's that enjoyment of learning. And that's what I want kids to have the most of. Can I enjoy this process called learning?
Fantastic, John. I think we'll be calling you the granddaddy of education now you've officially retired from your university role. I think that'd be a really nice moniker. Can I ask you, just in the end of these podcasts, what we're going to ask is who you think we should interview next? Who's the most significant people who we should then, have a look at, have a chat with and see what they can add to this whole conversation from around the world? You've mentioned the person who's just written the book in Indonesia.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I've never met him. I've met the minister, but I've never met the director general there. And I was impressed with what he's done in such a short time in such an incredibly large system. It makes England and Australia look tiny compared to what they have. And he's done it. And so, as you said, exactly my reaction when I read the book, I have hope. The common norm in our countries doesn't have to be the same. Doesn't have to be forever. And so he'd be someone that I'd be wanting to know a lot more from and listening to. My trouble is my list is very long.
Name a few anyway. We'll get through them. We've got plenty of time. Any more you'd add to it?
I've just been reading a book from a Ukrainian educator on science of learning, which was really, really impressive. My colleague James Anderson here in Melbourne is doing some really exciting stuff on learners, and I've seen him present, and he was certainly someone that's not well known, but extremely good at getting the narrative right. Our colleague Shirley Clark, she always impresses me. How she can take research and turn it into practice is a stunning work of art. And wow, you're embarrassing me now. I have a bundle of richnesses. And I have a lot of critics out there, and some of those critics, like Dylan Williams, who I still think is quite stunning in the way he's able to interpret the world out there. We disagree on lots of things, but we disagree agreeably, so that's that's how it should be. I'm going to take a rain check there.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much for adding all to that lexiconography of what we're talking about, what we're thinking about, how those arguments are progressing and how they're working. Delighted to be working with you again, coming towards the end of the year. So we'll put a mention on those two courses that we're going. Those visible learning, it was really interesting you mentioned that, because I know this came up through the conversation. One of those schools, I always remember, they started out the first year on that visible learning track, and the senior leaders were getting that data in, and they were doing the analysis, and then they were telling the teachers how to interpret it and what to do. By the next year, they were giving the raw data to the teachers, who were working out their own impact and their own progress, and then they were trying to work through that stuff, and it just changed the whole conversation completely. The senior leader's job now was as enabling of that process of how they could do it. They made 36 major changes in the school. They weren't huge changes, but altogether they just changed their emphasis. What did that school do the next year? They put the raw data in the hands of the students, taught this was a primary school, taught the students how to work out their own data as an individual, and then how to interpret their own data. Now the teacher's job was as an enabler. Now the school's job was as an enabler of the processes. And it just completely changed the narrative round. Stunning school now. When Ofsted went back in, it was just like, wow, what happened here? And I know every school's visible learning journey is different, and they're just quite remarkable from that. And you did that from your research that started, I know, as a hobby and then built up, and then you're able to share that right across. What a massive, significant thing. So whenever anyone criticizes academics in education, I always feel like saying, you go and see John Hattie. He's open to the criticism, and then secondly, he's done it. He's gone and he's worked across countries all over the world, schools across the world. And I don't know how many, there's tens of thousands of schools have now been affected directly by your work, and how many teachers that leads to, I don't know. I know your research study is huge on students, but I mean, the impact then onto those students is equally back. So thank you so much from the whole educational world from that. You've got waves behind you. That's what you've created. So absolutely fantastic. And thank you. I know you hate being praised and all that sort of stuff, but you've got it. So you'll have to put up with it.
Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, and thanks for tuning into this first version of the World Education Show. Many more to come. And if you want to suggest any guests that we should be interviewing and talking to about this, what we're focusing on is the passion, where it comes from, the practical steps that we need to take forward, and then what we can do as a whole to improve the lived lives and the lived experience of the children in the world today as they move up into adulthood. So thanks for tuning in, and thank you so much, John.